Welcome to another episode of the Upper Bowl Perspective, a Utah Jazz podcast showing that the fans sitting in the nosebleeds know just as much as those sitting courtside. For those of you who missed our last episode, we did an emergency pod right after the draft where we went over our thoughts on the Jazz's drafting Taylor Hendricks, Bryce Sensabaugh, and Keontae George. So if you want to know our thoughts on those three players, feel free to check out our most previous episode. With this podcast, we are getting really close to free agency. So we wanted to break this podcast out into two parts as we prepare for the rest of the Jazz's offseason post-draft. In this first segment, we're going to be talking about the current state of the Utah Jazz, who we currently have in our roster, our cap situation, along with what we really need to continue to develop this roster. And then in the second part of this episode, we're going to take that information and talk about some of our favorite free agent targets. So beginning with the current state of the Jazz roster, I'll quickly go through who we have and also who is a free agent or a potential free agent. Starting with our guard depth, we have Ochai Agbaji, Chris Dunn, Colin Sexton, and our new rookie Keontae George with guard depth. At forward, we have our all-star Lauri Markkanen, Kelly Olynyk, depending on if you consider him a forward or a small ball center, Taylor Hendricks and Bryce Sensabaugh, who we just drafted, along with Luka Samanic and Simone Fontecchio. And at center depth, we have Walker Kessler and Damian Jones. The Jazz have 6 free agents from last year. Jordan Clarkson, who has a $14 million player option. Taylor Horton-Tucker, who has an $11 million player option. Rudy Gay with a $6.5 million player option. I assume he's going to pick that up. We also have Udoka Azubuike, who's an unrestricted free agent, along with Juan Toscano Anderson. And Johnny Juzing is a restricted free agent who's on a 2-way contract. So looking at that depth in general, I just want to know your general thoughts because that's a lot of information we just threw out there. But what are you feeling about the current state of the Jazz's roster post-draft?
I say we got a lot of length, particularly in the higher end guys. I think all from point guard now, all the way down to center, we have plus length, which from everything that's been reported, especially by Tony Jones, who's my favorite of the Jazz beat reporters, that's really one of the Jazz's priorities going forward. I think that was perhaps the biggest weakness of the last iteration of the team. And it looks like they're learning, they're prioritizing it. And so that would be the biggest. I think if you're talking about strengths of the Jazz roster, it's got to be the fact that we're going to be one of the longer teams in the league next year of the guys that are at least going to be playing rotation minutes consistently, I think.
The thing I said is that it looks like in the not too distant future, we're going to have an extremely young roster. That's assuming that, either Jordan Clarkson opts out or we don't sign him this year. And so going unrestricted free agents next year. Rudy Gay again will probably opt in this year. It'd be surprising if he didn't, but again, going into next year, he'll be an unrestricted free agent. So we're really going to move away from a lot of these older players we have on contracts. And so again, I just hope that going forward, that the decisions we make are built around developing the young core that we have right now.
I think it's certainly going to be interesting. I remember the Jazz iteration a couple of years ago where we had guys like Bojan Bogdanovic, we had guys like Derek Favors, and even guys like Rudy Gobert were quickly aging. So it is nice to know that we have a lot of optionality in terms of what our lineup could look like going forward because we have so much youth. And we really don't have any bad contracts on our books pretty much at all. Even if somebody like a Taylor Horton-Tucker, who I don't think he's worth $11 million, even if he opts in, we only have him for another year. So the Jazz, not only in terms of have they done a good job at assembling a good young core, especially after this last draft, but they've also positioned themselves with their contracts in a way where they're going to have a lot of cap flexibility going forward, especially with the CBA, like you hear about the first apron and the second apron stuff, being able to make sure that you have guys on contracts that are very close to what they're actually valued. And that you don't have people who are on these albatross contracts is going to be incredibly important to building a roster that's going to be able to compete in the playoffs. And it's great to look at the Jazz's roster knowing that we don't have any major issues right now that are going to make it really difficult for us to build effectively in the future.
Absolutely. The CBA is going to come into a big part of it. I don't know how useful that cap space is going to be. I guess we'll talk about that in the second segment, but we do have a lot of it.
So we know that we have a lot of youth. We know that we have a lot of length, which are both fantastic things to have as a rebuilding organization. Now let's actually look at the basketball aspect of this a little bit more closely and what our rotations are actually going to look like. And I think the biggest thing that we were talking about in the draft that maybe we didn't perfectly get was we really wanted to see a point guard for the Jazz to take. And they ended up drafting Keontae George at the 16th overall pick. But as we talked about in our previous episode, while we feel he can develop into eventually becoming a point guard, he certainly isn't that right now. He's more of a combo guard or a shooting guard and an undersized one at that. What do you think the Jazz's guard rotation is actually going to look like? Do you want like Jordan Clarkson to opt in so we have an adult in the room for next year? Are you hoping that we just throw like Keontae George and Ochai Bagji out there for, 25 minutes each a night? Like, if you could ideally choose what you would do as a Jazz organization, would you want Clarkson back or would you hope that he opts out in terms of more flexibility?
I would
Personally, I think. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I would say that I think Jordan Clarkson, I think having the adult in the room, like you were saying, is important. I think going, as much as we're excited about the youth on the team, you do need veteran leadership. It feels like that's pretty consistently beneficial to young players. I also don't think those two ideas you throw out are mutually exclusive. You can bring back Clarkson and play them both 25 minutes a night on the same team, and I think that's perfectly fine. The number one goal, though, these guys need playing time and they need consistent playing time. There's no better way to develop than to play basketball. And so if you can bring back Clarkson and still give these two guys some major minutes, I would do it. That means maybe somebody else like Chris Dunn, you don't end up guaranteeing his contract and he's gone, something like that, or the other. But yeah, I would bring in some veteran presence, whether Clarkson opts in or we acquire a veteran guard. But I still, at the same time, think those guys need to be playing significant, meaningful minutes next year for the Jazz.
Yeah, my best case scenario, Jordan Clarkson would be some kind of sign and trade this offseason. I'd love the opportunity to get Clarkson to where he would want to go, somewhere where he could be competitive and possibly win an NBA championship, and at the same time maybe get some sort of return back for him. I don't love the idea of him getting a lot of playing time next season. He's someone who's worthy and has the skill set to get a lot of playing time, but I really would much rather see our younger guys get more playing time and more opportunities to develop. And I think that veteran presence is important, and I think mentorship is important, but I think we could probably get that somewhere in free agency for less than, $14 million a year. So, I mean, obviously, if he's here, I'm going to be happy. I'm going to cheer for him. He's beloved in Utah. He's always going to be beloved in Utah. I think he's going to be a long-term fan favorite, regardless of what happens. But I just think it might be better for both us and for Jordan Clarkson to find him a new home.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead, Kyler.
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah. With Clarkson, I think he's at the stage of the career where his skill set is one that, even though I love Jordan Clarkson, I'm not sure if he's the player that you would want to be influencing a bunch of young guards. I mean, Jordan Clarkson's a professional scorer. He's always been a score first kind of guy, and he's been fantastic at it. And the most successful season of his career was when that was pretty much his only job was to score buckets off the bench. And that's when he got a Sixth Man of the Year award and was part of a really, really good regular season Utah Jazz team. I think we've all talked about our desire to want to have defensive guards and to have well-rounded players and to have a team that can be versatile defensively and that doesn't have a lot of weaknesses, particularly along the perimeter from a defensive standpoint. So even though I love Clarkson and I certainly really would want him to see in a situation where he can compete now, I don't know if I love Clarkson's play style being something that I don't know if it's tolerated is the right word or even where it's something that is encouraged within a system where we got guys like Agbaji and Keontae George who I want to see them develop their two-way games, and I wouldn't want them to be in a situation where they're over, I don't know, idolizing or being mentored by a guy who has never played great defense in his entire career. So part of me wonders if it's almost better to move Clarkson to a better situation for him right now and then bring in a guy who's had a better defensive career who may not have the same playing impact as Clarkson, but might have a better cultural impact for similar money.
I just don't think that's the role of a mentor. Like a mentor is not there to say, "Hey, learn to play like me." A mentor is here to say, "Hey, here's how you handle adversity. Hey, here's how you handle this, that situation, and that." It's not, "Hey, learn how to play the game like I've played." So yeah, do I think Oshai and Keontae George should be Jordan Clarkson for the rest of their career? No, but I think that's not really the primary role of a mentor at all. Um, yeah, could he teach them some scoring tips, the way he uses leverage and stuff like that? Absolutely, but that doesn't mean they're going to turn into Jordan Clarkson. And so I just think that's not. And I think Jordan Clarkson, the way he handles the media, the way he deals with his teammates, is all really, really good, whether or not you like the way he plays basketball. And so I think he's a great mentor in that aspect of it. Another thing is, I think it's going to be a test for Ryan Smith. I mean, Ryan Smith is obviously a really big fan of Jordan Clarkson, and we'll see what kind of owner he is. If he's the guy that make kind of these friendship deals, maybe he overpays Clarkson because he really likes the guy. There hasn't been a super big test. The biggest test was obviously he was willing to trade away Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert last offseason. So I feel like he's not going to be that owner, but seeing as how he's still a really new owner, you always like to see different kind of tests of it's still early on. You're trying to gauge what kind of owner he's going to be.
Yeah, I don't have any doubt that he'll do what's best for the team. I think he's kind of handed the reins off as far as like basketball decisions to Danny Ainge and Justin Zanuck. I think he trusts them in their opinion and will follow suit with whatever they say. So we'll see. I know he went to an Imagine Dragons concert with Jordan Clarkson, which, you know, those are the type of experiences that are hard to walk away from. I get that.
Well, he also like reportedly had Jordan Clarkson's untouchable last year, which you can believe reports or not, but that's Jordan Clarkson is an untouchable level player. So I don't know.
It'll certainly be interesting to see what happens there because if Jordan Clarkson was made available in some sort of sign and trade scenario, I think he would definitely garner a lot of interest. There's not a lot of guys who are making $14 million a year who can create their own shot. And especially if you're relegating him to a bench role, a team that's just trying to get over the hump and really trying to contend for a title next year, someone like a Jordan Clarkson would be very attractive to several teams out there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Jazz there. But we certainly have a lot of young guards that we certainly hope get a lot of playing minutes this upcoming season. Moving on to the forwards, we have a few more forwards than we have guards. And to go through those names again, Lauri Markkanen, Kelly Olynyk, Lucas Samanic, Simone Fontecchio, and then Taylor Hendricks and Bryce Sensabaugh, who we just drafted this past week. Now, Markkanen is obviously going to be a starter. He's going to be playing a lot of minutes. After that, it's kind of a little bit more up in the air as to what the starting lineup may look like. You have Kelly Olynyk, who he's an older veteran, who we saw him last year was a solid contributor for the Jazz. We have our two rookies who both we obviously want to see what their upside looks like. But then with like a Samanic and Fontecchio, they played super limited minutes last year anyway, even when they weren't playing on a great Utah Jazz team. So my question for both of you is, what do you think, maybe let's say halfway through the season forward, what do you think the most likely scenario is for a guard rotation for the Jazz?
Forward rotation or a guard?
Forward rotation.
Okay. You can go first, Landon.
I think at this point in the season, we're talking like post All-Star break, right? Kind of at that point. I definitely think Taylor Hendricks is going to be in that starting lineup. I think it's going to be Lauri, Taylor, and Walker Kessler. Who's playing what? I'm not totally sure. I mean, obviously Kessler is going to be center, but between small forward and forward, I don't know who's going to officially be one of those two. But I think the majority of the minutes we're going to see being played post All-Star break is going to be Taylor Hendricks and Lauri Markkanen together in the front court.
Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable take. And then I think you're going to have Rudy Gay, who isn't a part of what you just said because he's on the technical player option. But if he's going to opt into it, which is very likely. I imagine he'll be playing over Fontecchio and Samanic, but who knows? Maybe not. Maybe Fontecchio is takes the role over Rudy Gay. It's not wouldn't be the most surprising thing in the world. And then obviously Olenek too. I also wouldn't mind getting somebody else so that maybe Olenek's more of your backup center, but I don't know. But like forward is definitely a spot you could sign like a good piece of like an 8-man rotation, though maybe not necessarily a starting caliber player.
Yeah, and I think you talk mentorship. I think like the forward space, if we're gonna sign someone, that's probably where we'd want that veteran presence because that seems like it's gonna be where the cornerstones of our franchise going forward are gonna be, or in those, forward and center positions.
The one name we haven't mentioned a ton in regards to the forward depth is Bryce Sensabaugh, where this is where I think it gets a little bit interesting to think of what kind of role he's going to play for the Jazz next season. With Taylor Hendricks, he's got the length, the athleticism, the defensive versatility that he's someone that you can see getting minutes quickly with the Jazz, even if he's not starting, just because he's going to have the ability to affect the game in more of a two-way impact more than a guy like Bryce Sensabaugh. For those of you who missed our last podcast, he was not projected to be a one and done out of Ohio State, but it was his scoring that really elevated him to becoming a first round draft pick, even when he wasn't originally expected to be in this year's draft. But Bryce Sensabaugh cannot defend anything right now. He is a terrible defender, and it's hard to imagine him getting consistent NBA minutes, even if he was a first round draft pick, unless he can get better on the defensive end of the court. Do you think that Sensabaugh is going to be playing a lot of NBA minutes this year? Do you think he's going to be spending a lot more time with like our G League team? Or do you think that he's someone who's just going to be riding the bench the rest of the season? Because for me, it's easy to see Keontae George, carving out a role for himself, certainly with Taylor Hendricks, but with Bryce Sensabaugh playing for Utah Jazz team that really values defense, I wonder if he's even going to crack into Will Hardy's rotation in any meaningful way because of his very apparent deficiencies on that end of the floor.
I would say I feel like the fourth forward spot or whatever you want to call it is a pretty low bar to pass. So I wouldn't be surprised if he passed it. We got kind of a three guys that you're confident are going to play a lot of minutes for us next year at that spot. But then, like, can he beat out Rudy Gay? Sure. Can he beat out Simone Fontecchio? Sure. You know what I mean? So I can see him playing minutes. I wouldn't be surprised if he spends most of the season on the G League either. He's going to need a lot of coaching, as all rookies do. But he does have an NBA ready skill set and his ability to kind of create shots for himself. And hit tough shots. So I wouldn't be surprised, but I wouldn't bet on it. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think his offensive upside is going to give him opportunities to play, at least, starting out the season. Who knows what happens by the end? I could totally see him, being relegated primarily to the G League. But we'll see. I think he could be at least competent defensively as like a power forward, depending on the lineups. If we're playing him at the 3 in large minutes, that's what really scares me. If we can mold him into more of a power forward, I think he has a better shot of getting more consistent minutes. But yeah, who's to say?
It would be a pretty small power forward. I think he's only like 6'5.5". So
yeah, it'd have to be some kind of like small ball lineup for sure.
Yeah, but he also doesn't have a ton of lateral quickness. So, and he's not like super speedy by any stretch. So, with Sensabaugh, I mean, he was able to score all of his points last year because he was crafty and because he was smart and he was able to get into situations where he could score. And it wasn't to do with his athleticism. So it'll be interesting to see how he develops. I don't think it would be bad if he spent a lot of time with the G League this season because it'll be a lot easier to get him minutes with the Salt Lake City Stars than it will be with Utah Jazz. And if he can get some good coaching around him, if he can really develop his defensive presence to, I don't know if he'll ever become a good defender or a plus defender, but if he can at least get out of the complete liability phase, then I think then I think his NBA path is a lot more clear than it currently is. Because for those of you who have been listeners to the pod for a long time, we are not big fans of guys who only play half of the basketball game. They are only good on one end of the floor. And Bryce Sensabaugh will certainly have to prove that he's more than just a bucket getter if he wants to get consistent minutes with the Jazz, especially when they have a lot of theoretical depth at that position.
Yeah, theoretical depth. I don't know. Did you guys watch the Justin Zanuck presser post draft? He said Sensabaugh was a top 18 pick on their board, and he actually likes his length and foot speed. So they must be higher on his defense than we are. So maybe he does get early minutes. Yeah, there's a couple things during that pressure that I think are worthy of discussion, but that's just one of them. I think the Jazz had him as like a surefire top 18 guy on their board, so they must have been pretty happy he fell to 28.
Yeah, as long as no one brought up vertical spacing, we're all right.
Nobody brought up vertical spacing on that presser.
Oh, goodness. Got PTSD from that comment. All right, so now looking at the center, we have Walker Kessler. He's our center of the future. No one expected him to be as impactful as he was his rookie season. And I mean, I was listening to, I believe it was the Bill Simmons podcast last week, and they even said that, is he the 7th or 8th best center in the league right now? Which I don't know if I would maybe have him that high, but he's certainly in the conversation of being one of those centers that are way more impactful than what you would get on the average NBA team. The question that I have for both of you is his backup, which right now it's Damian Jones. We had a comment a couple weeks ago where we talked about, do we feel comfortable having Damian Jones playing real minutes as a backup center? In certain matchups, Kelly Olynyk can play a little bit of small ball center as well, but it's not a perfect fit for him as well. So my question for you guys would be, we don't like using a ton of assets to get backup centers because they're really, really easy to get in general. But do you think it would be worth it for the Jazz to try to find a Damian Jones replacement or upgrade? Or do you think we should just roll with what we have?
Depends on the price, I guess. I don't hate Damian Jones as a backup. Again, I think we have Kelly Olynyk who can slide in and play that 5. Kelly's not a defensive player by any stretch. I think we saw that last year. So again, someone who has a little bit more of a defensive presence, which I think Damian Jones is probably a little bit better of a rim protector than he is good. But I think between the two of them, I'm decently content with that as being like our backup 5 option.
I feel like on the 15 man, you're going to need another big. Do I think they need to upgrade over Damian Jones though? No. G Bobby is the lowest on Damian Jones, I guess, of this podcast. I'm fine with him being our backup center next year, but would I want somebody to replace Udoka Azubuike? Yes, where, to be the backup center full time should an injury come, sure. But I think Damian Jones is a fine backup center. Yeah. And I don't want to spend assets on it.
I think we are all about as out as we can be on Udoka Azubuike. We appreciate your time in Utah, but
I don't appreciate your time in Utah. I'm sorry.
Enjoy your next stop.
It has nothing to do with him as a person. It's just he
Udoka,
was brought to a horrible situation that he never should have been put in.
Part of the offseason that ruined the Jazz title window. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to rant about it again.
And we hope that you find happiness somewhere else that's not Salt Lake City. So now that we've gone through all of our different positional depth, I think there's been a couple major, areas that we've identified the Jazz need to look at. One of them is a veteran presence to give some direction and some mentorship to some of our younger players, assuming that Jordan Clarkson doesn't come back. So that's the main one that we've kind of identified. But other than that, are there any other major team building aspects you think the Jazz should be prioritizing as we look into this offseason?
I don't know if free agency is really the place to, in most cases, look for long-term moves. But I just think long-term, if you're talking about weaknesses, I talked about some strengths. Weaknesses, I think we lack ball handling in our forwards. Like, who's our best ball handling forward? Is it Rudy Gay or is it Bryce Sensabaugh? That's a statement that's probably true, which I don't love. And then just guys who create plays for others at the guards position. I think we have guards that, another thing that Zanuck said in the pressers, he wants guards that can dribble, pass, and shoot. All of our guards can do that, but I don't know if we have anyone that's above average at creating plays for others. We have guards that are pretty good at creating shots for themselves. So handling at the forward spot, maybe some playmaking at the guard spot would be what I think the Jazz need long term. I just don't know if this is the free agency to do it, but who knows? That's what segment 2 is for.
Yeah. I mean, for me, perimeter defense is still an issue. I don't think we really addressed that. I think all of our guards that we still have are kind of lacking on that end of the floor. And I think we're still going to see, if things don't change, them getting burned a lot. And we're going to have to rely heavily on our forwards to kind of stop them at the rim. So that's something that I would like them to address somehow in some way.
Yeah, the biggest one that I had was the one that Kyler already touched on. Just finding a playmaker who is able to create opportunities for others is something that I would really love to see if we could get some sort of short-term rental for that, just in terms of helping the other guys develop. That was why I was so high on a guy like Anthony Black in the draft, is because his quick decision making and his ability to make his teammates better was something that I really, really appreciated about him when I was watching him at Arkansas. And while I certainly am super happy with the Taylor Hendricks pick, there is a little bit of a gap for that in the roster in terms of who is going to be the guy who is going to be actively looking for opportunities, not to score for himself, but to find the greatest opportunity for the team as a general to score, because I don't think we have that individual currently on our roster. But that will wrap it up for this first segment. It was a little bit of a quicker one where we just broke down who the Jazz currently have and what our needs are. So just to summarize, the main things you need to look at is ideally a veteran presence in case Jordan Clarkson doesn't opt into his contract. We could also use some playmaking, some perimeter defense, and hopefully some forwards who can handle the ball a little bit better, which would definitely increase our offensive versatility. We were going to take a quick break and we'll be back in just a few minutes for part 2, where we're going to talk about some of our favorite free agent options who may be able to help fill in some of these cracks. So we'll see you in just a couple minutes. Welcome back for part 2, where now that we've discussed what some of the Jazz weaknesses and needs are going into this next season, we're now going to discuss some of our favorite targets that we would love to see the Jazz try to acquire over the course of the offseason to help fill in some of those cracks. Let's go ahead and start with Landon. Who is an individual that you would want the Jazz to target either in free agency or via trade?
Yeah, I want to start off by saying I think this free agency, our main objective should be to spend as little money as possible and to tie up as few people into contracts as we possibly can. We've got a lot more people coming off of contracts next year, so I think we'll have more cap space. I think we'll have a little bit more of an understanding of what our team is next year. So I'd much prefer us to hone in on free agency either next year or the year after next and really try to, round out our team. So as far as this year, I want someone or people who aren't going to get a lot of playing time. We don't expect to get a lot of playing time now. We can get for short-term affordable deals. So with that said, one of the people that I think might be interesting would be Tristan Thompson. I think he's an unrestricted free agent this year. Yeah, didn't get a lot of playing time for the last few seasons, so I don't think that's necessarily an expectation for him. I think we could get him on a 1 or 2 year deal. He's got that veteran presence, so I think he could really help mentor Walker Kessler and Taylor Hendricks, especially on the defensive end. I think he's been kind of known as, a defensive specialist throughout his time in the league, a good, hard-nosed rebounding type of player. So I think he could help show them around the league, show them a trick or two. He was obviously caught up in all that Kardashian drama, so he knows how to handle the media. You can help him on that side as well. And he just seems like a chill guy. I don't think I've really heard anything about him causing any locker room issues. So I think he's a good locker room presence as well. So someone like him, I think, is someone that might be good to target this free agency.
And he's played in a lot, of big games. I mean, even in this postseason, he was kind of resurrected from his place on the end of the bench, and he came in and he played like really impactful minutes in this last year's playoffs, despite not playing a lot for the past couple seasons. So even seeing him where he's been delegated to a much lesser role than he was earlier on in his career, he still kept himself ready. He still kept himself available, which I think shows a lot of character. And I think shows that he's been putting a lot of preparation to step up in those biggest moments, which I would love to see our guys learn from a guy like him, even though his basketball impact may not be super significant. I think the cultural aspect could be great.
And that's the kind of we do need a third big, and I think that's a good call on the kind of caliber of player, because it shouldn't take a long contract or an expensive one to bring him here. I mean, if he's looking for a long-term contract, I'd maybe even just give him maybe a little bit more money for a 1 year contract and maybe pay him a little bit. I don't mind it for this year because, as you said, free agency is not super strong, and I don't think there's going to be great uses of the cap for us for like big time long-term contracts.
Mhm.
Like it. Good pick. Kyler, I know that you haven't been in love with this free agent class, but were there any free agents that you thought that the Jazz should consider, or are you just completely out on this free agent class in general?
So I was doing my homework on this episode, trying really hard to find a free agent match that I like really could get myself excited about. But while I was doing so, I was just scrolling on Twitter, and Tony Jones, once again, second time I'm referencing him on this podcast, does great work. So I'd say he's a must follow if you have Twitter and you're a Jazz fan. But he was talking about perhaps calling up Washington, right? Washington's the team that's definitely blown it up the most this offseason. And they have a little point guard by the name of Monty Morris, who I think is a good playmaker. He'd be a short-term investment and just a guy who'd come in and I think play the role that I think Clarkson could play, but maybe more the style of play that would be more beneficial to the young guys next for the season. So this is more of a if the Jazz and Clarkson can't come to a deal, I would just see what it would take from Washington. They're blowing it up. They've got young guards on their roster right now. They, just acquired Jordan Poole. And what it would take, I have no idea. Maybe if THT opts in for 11 million, they'd like to take the swing on the younger guard and THT. We throw him a second and that gets you Monty Morris. I have no idea what it'd be. It's not like I'm saying we should throw an unprotected first to Washington for Monty Morris or anything like that, but I would at least gauge his market. But to Landon's point, I think my goal for free agency is to acquire assets rather than spend money this year. We could take on a bad contract, I think, for 1, maybe 2 years max, and just see if we can actually bring in a guy like that. Because even though, yes, we have more cap space next year, I just don't. What are we going to use it on? We're gonna lure Jaylen Brown to come from the Celtics to the Jazz. I don't know. So I think we're at the stage of the rebuild. I would rather be acquiring assets or taking these short-term shots rather than handing out a big contract to a restricted free agent that somebody might, other Jazz fans in the Jazz Twitterverse are saying that we should be doing.
Which,
Yeah,
when you look at this sorry,
Oh,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Landon.
I'll just say, like, free agency and cap space with the Jazz is interesting because we are not in LA, we're not in New York. So our cap space should be looked at and valued differently than you would for other teams. And the way we use it is different than for certain other teams. Not to say that we can't be unsuccessful or get talent, but it's just, you got to look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, like Bojan Bogdanovic coming to us was one of the biggest free agents we'd gotten in a really long time. And like Carlos Boozer was one as well. And he turned out to be really good for the Jazz, but I think he even maybe outplayed his original projections when he signed with Utah. And so like that's the caliber, that's like the top end caliber free agent that the Jazz have been historically getting. And Utah is a growing market. So who knows, perhaps we'll break that seal one day and maybe be able to reach one more tier above. But are we ever going to get the max 27-year-old all-star borderline all NBA caliber to willingly come to Utah? Unless we're the only team offering him that contract, I don't think so.
Which it's like my thought in approaching free agency was I completely agree in how can we just accumulate assets that we can later use to package later for trades or other situations that'll, that we have more control over. Because when it comes to free agency, we can make the best deal out there and the individual could still opt to go play for an LA or a Miami, or if I got the same offer from Utah or Denver, I'd rather go play with Jokic, right? So I think that that's always going to be an issue for us. One thing that made me think a little bit more about how we should maybe view the situation is how Golden State handled D'Angelo Russell a few years ago, about how it was pretty clear that when Klay Thompson was hurt, that D'Angelo Russell was likely not a long-term solution for the Golden State franchise, but they kept him. I believe they extended him. And then when the time was right, they were able to flip him for additional assets. And I think that that's not a bad kind of strategy to look at, is how can we just take a guy who may be younger, who's shown flashes? Can we give him maybe a bigger contract now? And then, to fill that cap space, and then eventually take that player and move them to another team that might be a better fit down the road and acquire assets as part of that deal. I would still rather do it if we could just take a bigger contract for like 1 year and then like maintain that more long-term flexibility. But if that's not an option, I wouldn't mind throwing money at one of these younger guys who've shown some upside and then hopefully being able to turn them into more assets down the road. And I think the biggest name that comes to mind for that would be an Austin Reeves. I think the Lakers are probably going to match whatever offer we give him. But in the off chance that they don't, he can be offered 4 year, 98 million. And for a little less than 25 million a year, I think he could be a solid building block for a franchise or a great asset to turn into later. He was he was the third best player for the Lakers this year, and he was fantastic for them in the playoffs. He showed up every night. He was consistent. He is a fantastic scorer, and he's still only 25 years old, so he should hopefully get better over the next few seasons. So for me, if I'm the Jazz, if I don't have a trade lined up where I can take back one of these big contracts and maybe get some additional assets as part of that, I would take a long, hard look at Austin Reeves and see if we can at least get him to sign an offer sheet, even if the Lakers end up matching it.
I don't mind it in the
Yes.
sense of making the Lakers match you because just making them pay even more is awesome. But you brought up the Golden State situation, and I think it's a very different situation because in the case of Golden State losing Kevin Durant, they were still going to be over the cap. And so they weren't getting off of really money. They were going to be only allowed the mid-level exceptions. So they did what's best for them is they at least turned Kevin Durant into something, right? With D'Angelo Russell, which they then flipped later. That's not the case for the Jazz. They'll still have they're under the cap, and so I think it's a different spot where teams over the cap, absolutely. If you have just like turn something into something else as much as you can, but I just don't think that's the case for the Jazz. And I think you're giving a guy like Austin Reeves, who's had one really good playoff run and was kind of turning it up as the regular season went off, but it's still there's a lot of 1 year wonders out there. Just ask that a lot of the what's his name, Chandler Parsons, who got a massive deal for being really good for a year, and it just turned into a hugely negative asset. And so I think the risk that Austin Reeves ends up not being the player that he showed for a season next to Anthony Davis and LeBron James, and all of a sudden him becoming a very negative 4 year, $24.5 million a year contract, I just wouldn't take that risk, especially because we have a lot of young guards, and he'd just be. I'm fine with taking a short-term commitment for somebody taking some minutes next year. I don't want somebody taking minutes for the next 4 years, potentially.
Yeah, I think Kyler basically said exactly what I was going to say. I like him as like a short-term solution, maybe, but at the end of the day, I want Keontae George and Ojai Jabaji. Sorry, I probably messed that up, but I want them playing minutes and growing into a starter. And I think Austin Reeves is probably not good enough to be an all-star, but he's not good enough to be a bench player. So I'd be concerned about what his role would be long-term with the Jazz if we were to try to sign him to a long-term deal.
Which I think all the points you make are super fair. I mean, I looked at the list of free agents this year for probably an hour and a half, trying to find a guy that I'd love the Jazz to like make an offer to that I felt great about. And there really wasn't one, which I think talks about how difficult this free agent class looks, especially if you're a rebuilding team. Because even though I brought up the Austin Reeves thing, I wouldn't be upset if they offered him and he signed for the 4 years, $98 million, but I certainly wouldn't feel great about it. And I think it just highlights the overall state of the Jazz right now, which is we're not trying to be great next year. We're trying to develop and we're trying to make guys who are going to be better long-term fits and who can be pieces that we can build around as we try to pursue an NBA championship here in a few years. And there's going to be very few guys in free agency who are going to match that timeline or who are going to match the amount of money or the assets that it would take to get somebody like that. So I think we're all aligned in the general strategy the Jazz should take, which is let's play these young guys as much as we possibly can. Let's let them develop. Let's put the pieces around them that will help them develop, like a veteran presence. And then with our remaining cap space, let's see how we can use that to acquire additional assets that we can hopefully later flip to find the last piece or two. Once we have a core that we feel confident we can try to make a finals run with.
Yeah, I mean, the Jazz are probably going to be involved. They already are involved in a lot of these. The Jazz are interested in this player or that because we're one of the few teams that can just take a player's salary right now and not even have to send back matching salary to the other team. And so that's going to, I think, put us involved in a lot of trade talks. What happens with them? I don't know. The one that comes to mind is like Tobias Harris, and the Jazz are already linked. How many years in a row have the Jazz been linked to Tobias Harris? I have no idea. It's been a lot, though. Ever since I actually wanted them to sign him in free agency that 1 year, all those years ago. But stuff like that, like big expiring contracts where a contending team would rather have the cap space to use elsewhere. That's going to be probably my main priority. What can we get? Although the Sixers apparently are actually looking for assets in return for Tobias Harris, which is ludicrous.
Yeah, I mean, getting draft picks and assets in returns for taking on bad contracts to fill that cap space, I think, is a pretty solid strategy. But I also think we could use those to sign quality players when the time comes. I just think we got to time that out in a way that's good. Once we are secure in what our identity is as a team, we understand who our main guys are going forward, then we can kind of identify the deficiencies in that team and address those in free agencies, kind of sure things up around the fringes. Because again, we're probably not getting that, first team All NBA All-Star guy, but I think we could get some solid role players with the cap space that we could have in the next few years, even if we might have to overpay a little bit for it. I think that's kind of how I'd hope they'd utilize it. I think you look at, the last time the Jazz made a run with Mitchell and Gobert, part of the issue was they had teams that all had the same deficiencies, and we had no flexibility to address those weaknesses. So we just saw us, get taken advantage of again and again and again in the playoffs. So I think as long as we time it right and we know exactly what our strategy is, what our championship path is, then go forward and, go nuts in free agency.
And that's what's such a big question right now is that we have no idea what that championship path looks like right now because all of the players we hope to be part of that hopefully championship winning team, we don't even know which ones are going to be relevant to that. I mean, we have Kessler, who looks like he can get to that point. We have Markkanen, who's an all-star level player. But we haven't seen enough out of Agbaji to say, do we really, really feel comfortable with this guy being part of an 8-man rotation if you're trying to play for a title? I don't think we've seen enough out of him yet. There's been flashes saying he could get there, but he's certainly not there yet. And we just drafted 3 rookies. As we mentioned in the last podcast, half of rookies are never going to be quality starters. So do we know that, Taylor Hendricks hit and Keontae George hit, but maybe Bryce Sensabaugh was a bust? Then we know how to build around it. Or similarly, maybe Bryce Sensabaugh becomes the best out of the 3. I wouldn't bet on it, but what if it does happen and Taylor Hendricks and Keontae George aren't starting caliber players? I mean, there are just so many different futures that could happen depending on how our young guys develop that we can't even predict this is what we need to focus on getting right now in terms of team building, which is why we need to make sure we have the maximum flexibility a few years from now, both in terms of cap space and hopefully draft assets that we can use to try to acquire those players that will fit well with those pieces we know can be part of a winning basketball team. So it's always a fun conversation. Now that we're finally post-draft, which we know that we've been in the weeds on for the past few months, it's fun to see that the Jazz are going to start developing these players. We're going to see what happens with all these guys in Summer League. We're going to see what the Jazz end up doing in free agency. And we're certainly going to be here for every step of the way to bring you all of your favorite Jazz offseason content. If you have anything that you'd like us to discuss, please feel free to drop it in the comments. We'd be more than happy to talk about it in a future episode. Also, please like and subscribe. It certainly does us a lot of good, and we would love to see you back for our future episodes. This has been another edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective. Thank you for joining us on some more Jazz chats, and we'll see you next week.